Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for some of you. Thank you for participating on this webinar about safeguarding the health and safety of children in agriculture. First, I will introduce myself. My name is Nathalie Ostiou. I'm a researcher on the French Research Institute of Agriculture, Environment and Health, on food, sorry. And I'm belonging to the board of the International Association of Work in Agriculture. This webinar is organized by the International Association of Work in Agriculture and the National Children's Center for Rural and Agricultural Health and Safety. Sorry. First, I want to give you some information about what is the International Association of Work in Agriculture, called IAWA. The aim of the IAWA is to bring together the research and development community studying agricultural work around the world, on crossing disciplinary and thematic entries, in order to understand, analyze, and compare the realities of work and workers in agriculture, and to be able to think about the future of work. We have a board composed with different people from different countries, disciplines, and topics. We can see the name on the slide. I don't give all the name, but we have some of today organizing this workshop as Benoît Dedieu, which is the president of the association, Florence Becot, which is a member of the board from Marshfield Clinic Research Institute, and Marion Beecher from Tigasque in Ireland, and with Isabelle also, Isabelle Avlanche from INRAE too. Some information about what the IAWA, some activities of the IAWA. IAWA produce some newsletter. It is a monthly report on events, calls on publication of work in agriculture. We also organize some international symposiums. The last one took place in 2021 about the topic of future of work in agriculture. And after this is international symposiums of collective publication were produced. For example, one of the last one was a special issue on work in agriculture, new perspectives in frontiers in sustainable food systems. And there is another one in progress for the Journal of Rural Studies about decent work. The IAWA also organized some international workshops. The last one took place in 2018 about how to build a territorial approach of work on employment in agriculture. And other activities is the activities that we have today, the thematic webinar. The first one was organized last year about work on employment in the governance of agricultural value chain. And today the topic is about health and safety of children in agriculture. You can become a member of the association. It is free, and you have all the information about the website of the association. Why to organize a thematic webinar of the association about safeguarding the health and safety of children in agriculture? For that, we use and we work together with some colleagues from the National Children's Center for Agriculture and Health and Safety on the United States. And some of you have participated to a special issue published in Frontiers in Public Health. And the aims are to provide an overview of health and safety issues impacting children in agriculture, on the broader connection to social and economic sustainability in agriculture. Another objective is to provide a general overview of current approaches to preserve the health and safety of children in agriculture, and as well as current gaps. Other one is to discuss opportunities for future interventions and future research, and to support the development of a network of scholars and practitioners for future research on the development of interventions. Some information about the program. First, we will start by a presentation of Barbara Lee from the National Children's Center for Agriculture, Health and Safety in the US about a general overview of children's health and safety in agriculture. And then we will have discuss about international experiences and perspectives in children, agricultural health and safety. It will be a roundtable moderated by Florence Becco, also from the National Children's Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, or USA. The speakers will be for Argentina, Marcos Grigioni, who is an independent researcher. From Australia, Richard Franklin from the James Cook University. From Burkina Faso, Eugénie Maïga from University Norbert Zongo. From Sweden, Peter Lundqvist from the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and for United States, Barbara Lee. After the roundtable, we will have an interactive discussion with all of you. I will give some information later after the roundtable how we will proceed. And finally, we will finish by a conclusion from Marion Beecher from TIGASC.
Hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. It's early morning here in Wisconsin in the US. So Wisconsin is in the central part, north central part of the United States, very much of a farming area. So I want to thank IAWA and especially Florence, my colleague at work, and Natalie and all of you who did such a great job of organizing this webinar. I'm going to share a little bit about our the big picture of what's going on with children in agriculture. Our center in Marshall was established in 1997, so we've been around for 26 years. And we are the largest dedicated center in the United States, just with addressing children and agricultural safety and health. We have a staff of 18 scientists and outreach educators and support staff, and a network of over 250 people, mostly from the United States, that we call the Childhood Agricultural Safety Network. So we've been doing this for a long time and appreciate the opportunity to share this all with you. And Florence, the next slide, please. Just an overview of what I'm going to cover is just a little bit of terminology of the words that we use when we describe these events and how they're different and impacted by kind of the etiologic factors of what's going on around the child when a child is injured. Factors, what is the role of adults, kind of, the cost of this, and then some protective strategies. And then I want to just highlight our special issue of Frontiers in Public Health. And we have 3 of the co-editors on the call today with Florence and Richard Franklin and Peter. So it was a 18-month experience of getting papers together from different countries, and very eye-opening in terms of the differences and some of the similarities. Next slide. So in any language, translation of certain words is complicated. And it was about 50 years ago in the English language, people specializing in injury prevention realized that when we use the term accident, people felt like there was nothing you could do about it. And so accident in general terms meant that it was an act of God or you could not prevent it. But in fact, through the research, they realized that injuries were very much like diseases. They're almost predictable and you can prevent them. So for the most part, we try to replace that word with something like an injury event or a crash or something like that. And you'll see that even in our special issue of Frontiers, we asked the authors if they could avoid using that word. That would be consistent with how people see it. Of course, we're gonna use it sometimes just because it's human nature. But at our center, we're making a concerted effort to work with journalists, reporters, and other safety professionals to avoid using that word because of its implications that we can't do anything about it. Next slide. So we'll just talk about some of the general characteristics and why this whole area, it's so complicated. It's not like a single disease with a single cure, but we're looking at the age of children, all different ages from 0 really up through when we talk about youth in the US, we say under 18 years of age. Other countries use different languages or different terms for, is it a child, a youth, adolescent, this type of thing. So first of all, we kind of have to know what we're talking about. And then within that child, we have their level of development, like physically. We try not to just use ages, because each child is so uniquely different in terms of their body shape, strength, their cognitive abilities, socially, how are they? And then emotionally, what can they handle? And when we promote work or involvement of children, we try to look at all of those aspects of the child before you suggest that something is safe or unsafe for that young person to do in farming. Then the big thing that we have found through our statistics is that many of the children in agriculture are injured, but they're not even working. In fact, in the US, about 2/3 of the children injured are not working. They're bystanders, young children who just happen to be in the way. They could be observing what their parents are doing. They might be helping out a little bit, but not really. Or they could be in the process of being trained to take on work. And then the other category, of course, is children who are actively working in the farm production, and they could be working on a family farm, or they could be hired to work on a farm. So those are the general categories that we use when we talk about, prevention, protecting kids, because you kind of have to know what's going on with the group that you're trying to help make a resolution to their injuries. Next slide. There's other conditions that we look at, sort of the etiology of what's going on in that situation that leads up to or puts a child at risk. So you'll hear from the different countries, the different kinds of farming work that children do. So what are the tasks that they're doing? Is it, a big farm, a small farm? Is it crops? Is it animals? Is it cocoa beans? Is it, hand harvesting pistachios, or, what exactly are the children involved? And then based on that, what are the hazards of the job, and what are the exposures? Are there chemicals? Are there machines? Is there a lot of noise? And how fast are they working, or how slow is it, having to do with the commodity itself? And then there's the environmental and economic impacts, such as weather. Certainly climate change and big weather events are huge nowadays that we're giving more attention to. And then there's market prices and global trade agreements. And in fact, what we're finding now, at least in the US, like the strongest non-regulatory major influence on children's role in agriculture is some of these audits. We call them the big box companies that do the big trading, global transfer of products that have much more strict rules. They're not laws, but if you want to trade your product, you have to abide by their expectations of what children are doing for that product. Another issue is just the fact that many of the farms are in rural areas. Maybe you can go back to that slide. In the rural areas, they might have less health care. There might be fewer education opportunities. There might be limited daycare, and they may not have internet access to find out, what's going on with the weather, or or YouTube, how do I deal with a certain issue? So just being rural in agriculture can have a major impact on the safety of a child, and certainly on the emergency response if a child is injured. Then there's social and cultural conditions, such as farming practices, long-standing traditions. We say it's easier to bury a tradition than it is to bury a child. And it's really important that we set aside unsafe traditions that have been carried on for generations. Then there's, the family needs. Do we need the child to work? Many times it's the child who wants to work, even though the family might not be totally dependent on them. Then there's cultural influence, such as, again, what are the work tasks? What are the roles of the gender? boys versus girls. We know that boys are much more likely to be injured with a farm work than girls. And then there's other things such as, are they a migrant family, and is it a religious group that has certain expectations on the farming practices? And then we kind of talked about the market, which again is becoming more and more influential in the role of children. And what does the consumer expect? If avocados are harvested by children in Mexico and shipped to the United States, many times there's a public campaign to boycott certain products. And then things like peer pressure, especially for teenagers who do things or take risks and that type of thing. So that's just sort of, it shows the picture of how things are so complicated that there's just not a simple fix to protecting children. Next slide now is, we'll just talk about the non-fatal, the serious childhood injuries. We typically say a minor injury means there's less than 4 hours of inactivity, and major means there's 4 hours or more of inactivity. It could be something, just a sprain, a strain, a broken bone, or it could be a life-altering disability or an amputation. Here's just a news clip, of an amputation, which is not that uncommon, but we say when children are injured in agriculture, it is more traumatic and gruesome typically than when they're injured, if they're working at a grocery store or helping out at their parents' restaurant, something like that. That agriculture, by its nature, has more traumatic and gruesome injuries. There's always the question of who is responsible for the child, and what do we do about that? And then for an injury, there's a lot of costs, and we have, costs projected at that. Is it a private cost that the family has to pay? Is it long-term rehabilitation? And then certainly the whole emotional toll on family and friends of what do we do now that we have an injured child whose life, maybe they wanted to be a piano player or use a computer and they had an arm amputated. So there's just a huge thing of emotional toll and who is supervision and guilt and blame and this type of thing when a child is injured. On the next slide, we're going to talk about, the next slide was going to be about children who are killed, and I think Florence will help us get back. There we go. So when a child is killed on a farm, it could be immediate. Sometimes it's delayed. And again, the question is, who was in charge? What happened? There's a lot of news reports that, why was this child left alone? And why were they exposed to these different types of injuries? Or who decided that, a 4-year-old should ride on the tractor with grandpa? So there's always that question of responsibility, and are there any legal consequences? The truth is, at least in the United States, even if laws were broken, if it's on a farm, they rarely take legal action. And that's something I've been studying. It's like, why do they treat farm parents different than city parents? If a child was left alone and exposed to something dangerous. In the city, if it's something like leaving kids in a hot car or exposure to guns, they would be jumping on it to, consider this a crime for neglecting a child, but it rarely happens in agriculture. So then there's, again, the costs, the financial costs, immediate costs, long-term losses, especially if it was somebody who was actively involved in the farm work. And again, the huge emotional toll. A lot of this does get news coverage and the community knows, and the family suffers, again, terrible guilt, and especially if it's a loss of a child. And then interesting is when there's more than one child involved, or it's a family that has had a repeat of dangerous situations where it's one child and then another child and the third child is seriously injured or killed. that it affects their involvement in the community and their reputation in agriculture as well. So next slide, we'll just ask, like, so how do kids get injured on the farm? And you'll hear, from the different countries, there's different ways, but most commonly, it's motor vehicles. It's tractors, tractors like on the farm, tractors that are just big and you can't see the children, or the child is riding on the tractor, falls off, is run over. In many countries, ATVs or quad bikes are becoming more and more common on the farm. They're used for work or a little bit of a crossover between work and recreation. And it's just a kind of a healthcare emergency right now in terms of all of the ATV and quad bike injuries and deaths to young people. Livestock, certainly big animals and exposure to them being crushed or stepped on or kicked. And then we have things like drowning, especially for small children in the ponds. We've even had some where there was large buckets of water and a young child drowns in that. And then there's other things like noise and certainly musculoskeletal disorders, even at a very young age, developing things like back pain, leg pain from heavy lifting and improper body mechanics. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about proactive strategies. Oh, sorry, forgot about this one. So, Florence, if we want to go back, yeah, illness and nowadays we have much more information about zoonotic and other diseases, what's passed on that's infectious disease. We have things like mental illness, dust and moles and noise. So different things, again, depending on what the commodity is, and keeping in mind that a young body is still growing, so they cannot tolerate as much of the high level of exposure that an adult worker might be exposed to. Okay, and the next slide, when we get into protective strategies, from the big picture, I'm going to just share two models. The first one we call the socio-ecological model, where it's like what's been shown for protective strategies is multiple different strategies repeated at different levels. And so at the bottom level is the child who is not in charge of their own protection or prevention. And then that works up through the model that the adult, the parent, is responsible. And then we have this interpersonal level of relationships, friends, neighbors, healthcare providers, moving up to kind of the community, the churches, the media can have influence, and then organizations. And then at the highest level, having the greatest influence on protective behaviors or practices is public policy, regulations, labor laws, locally, that type of thing. And this is where we have great differences in different countries. And some countries have strong laws, and they enforce them. Some have strong laws, but nobody enforces them. In the United States, we have laws that are very outdated and rarely enforced, and very small fines if anybody challenges them. And then all of that gets challenged when there's a labor shortage and we just need the kids to fill in because we need some workers. So this is what we call the socio-ecologic model, which applies to many types of prevention strategies. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the next model that's used very much in industrial safety, which is a hierarchy of controls where we go from the top down, completely eliminating the hazard or removing the child from the farm is the number one safety strategy, especially if it's a small child who is not working. And then we work our way down the hierarchy of, replacing the hazard or moving the people, engineering controls, and then personal protective equipment and things like, making sure a young person has steel-toed boots and goggles and hearing protection. So this kind of describes the way we look at what's our approach in trying to protect children whether they're working or not working. And then I wanted to wrap this up by encouraging everyone to take a look at the ebook that's available free of charge on Frontiers in Public Health. It's just been released. It has over 200 pages. If you're going to print it out, you need a lot of ink to do that. It's 29 papers, and 8 of them are a specific country, looking at what's going on in their country. We do have research from other countries other than their perspectives. There's 57 different authors. And as I mentioned, it's free online, and it's got a full range of paper from research and strategies and things that have worked, some things that haven't worked, and then just kind of that bigger picture of what's different in the different countries when we're trying to protect children. So that's my overview, and I look forward to the next session where we talk about what's going on in the specific countries.
Thank you so much, Barb. I am going to stop sharing this presentation to then dive into our international panel, but I think that you gave us an excellent overview of the kinds of topics we're going to talk about today and the kinds of factors that we are seeing. So I'm going to share my screen. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about international experiences and perspectives in children, agricultural health and safety. And the way that we're going to do this is, as Barb mentioned, over the last year and a half, we worked on the special issue for Frontiers in Public Health. And one of the things early on that we did is we wanted to specifically include a diversity of perspectives and experiences from around the world through commentaries. And what we did is the group of the special issue editor reached out to their contacts around the world and asked folks, will you please be willing to write a commentary? We reached out to a number of countries. We reached out to several countries. As Barb mentioned, we had 8 who said yes. And then we reached out to some countries where folks said, actually, we don't talk about children, ag health and safety. And that was the case in France, when at the time I reached out to Benoit and Natalie from Iowa and asking who could write the French perspective. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from 5 of the writers of the commentaries. I was very excited that out of the 5 that I invited, everyone said yes. The idea here was to hear from a range of perspectives from people in different countries. If you look at the map, we have folks here today from almost all of the continents. They are representing, essentially, we wanted a diversity of social, economic, political, cultural environment to really talk about the situation of ag health and safety for children. What is the situation and what are different countries doing? What are different countries? I want to point out too, the panelists will talk about it, but we have some really interesting diversity in the panels. For example, when we look at population density in the countries, which is going to have an impact not only on the agricultural sector, but the kinds of social and physical infrastructures that are available. Our population density ranges from 3.4 people per square meter in Australia, all the way to 68.3 in Burkina Faso. And then looking at the importance of agriculture in this country's economies, we go from agriculture representing 24.4% of the GDP in Burkina Faso to around 1 to 2% in Sweden and the US. And then the last thing I would say too, we know that there are very important variations in terms of child labor laws, as well as social policies and agricultural policies. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and the way that the panel will work is first they will do a high-level presentation of their countries, and then after this high-level presentation from all of them, we will have the panel discussions with questions. So first we will have Marcos Grigoni. Marcos is from Argentina. He's a surgeon, farmer, as well as a researcher. Then we will have Richard Franklin. Richard is a faculty member at James Cook University in Australia. We will then have Eugénie Mega from the University of Norbert Zongo in Burkina Faso, and Eugénie is an economist. We'll have Peter Lundquist from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Sweden. And then we will have Barb from the National Children's Center for Ag Health and Safety in the US, and you have just heard of Barb. And then the other thing too that I wanted to say is if you are interested in hearing more about this country's perspectives, I included the screenshots of all their commentaries in the special issue. But without further ado, let's have Marcos get us started.
Buenos días, muchas gracias por la invitación a participar. Primero quería contarles que en mi país la actividad agrícola-ganadera es una de las más importantes de todas las actividades económicas y por ello tenemos muchísimas personas trabajando y desarrollando tareas en el medio agropecuario. Quisiera decirles que respecto a los niños, según el último Censo Nacional Agropecuario del año 2018, más de 100.000 niños y niñas menores de 14 años viven en el campo. Y otra fuente de información, que es el Censo de Actividades en Niños y Adolescentes del año 2017, que es una encuesta que se hizo en nuestro país, informó que cerca de 1 millón de niños entre 5 y 15 años viven en el medio rural, de los cuales alrededor de 207.000 hacen actividades o tareas rurales vinculadas a cuestiones domésticas o de tipo productivas y de autoconsumo. Siempre es importante tener en cuenta que también en nuestro país tenemos una enorme cantidad de niños que visitan el campo por cuestiones vinculadas a el turismo rural o a actividades de tipo recreativas. Como ustedes verán, en nuestro sector agropecuario tiene todo tipo de actividad y produce múltiples tipos de commodities y productos. Más de 100 productos se generan en nuestros campos y eso es muy importante porque se genera en toda la superficie del país. De punta a punta, nuestro país tiene actividad agropecuaria y eso en el país que es el 8º país en superficie en el mundo, habla de que son distintas las condiciones geográficas, las cuestiones tradicionales, culturales, los tipos de producción, y todo eso lleva a que nuestros niños están expuestos, de acuerdo al lugar del país, a distintos tipos de riesgos. En los lugares donde se trabaja mucho en ganadería, tenemos riesgos muy distintos a los lugares donde solamente se hace agricultura. Y al ser una superficie tan extensa la de nuestro país, tenemos ese desafío de entender que hay, según las regiones, distintos tipos de riesgos en los cuales trabajar para prevenirlos. La próxima, por favor. Cuando queremos hablar de los incidentes vinculados a lo que les ocurre a los niños en el campo, lamentablemente no tenemos estadísticas gubernamentales oficiales que nos hablen sobre ese tema. Por eso es que recurrimos a los medios de comunicación, que son los que publican y nos informan acerca de lo que pasa, como dije antes, en nuestra extensa superficie agropecuaria. Y así vemos que, por ejemplo, en el año 2013 tuvimos 33 niños fallecidos, en el 2014 44, y en los últimos 5 años 241 casos fatales de incidentes en niños. La mitad casi de estos incidentes afectó a niños y niñas de menos de 5 años. Eso es un dato muy importante, ya que nos empieza a explicar qué es lo que está pasando respecto del cuidado de los niños en el campo argentino. Cuando vemos y analizamos las causas de estos incidentes, vemos de nuevo que van a variar estas causas de acuerdo a la zona o la región donde han ocurrido estos incidentes. Así, en zonas donde existe mucha producción, por ejemplo en lechería o mucha producción vinculada a la ganadería, vemos que los incidentes con animales, principalmente caballos, están a la orden del día y son las causas principales. Niños y niñas pequeños que caen de esos caballos y sufren traumatismos cráneoencefálicos que ya sea en el momento o posteriormente a varios días de estar internados, fallecen por esta causa. También los ahogamientos, como dijeron anteriormente, y los accidentes con maquinaria son causas muy, muy importantes de incidentes en niños. La próxima, por favor. Respecto de las leyes, en nuestro país existen numerosas leyes también que regulan y castigan el trabajo infantil. Es decir, el trabajo infantil se refiere a que todo trabajo para menores de 16 años está prohibido y está castigado con prisión, ¿sí? Es muy importante también ver que hay algunas excepciones, como son los niños o adolescentes entre 14 y 15 años, que pueden trabajar en empresas de tipo familiares, pero teniendo presente algunas cuestiones como ser que no pueden trabajar más de 3 horas por día. Cuando ya los adolescentes tienen entre 16 y 17 años, pueden trabajar de alrededor de 6 horas por día, pero no más de 36 horas por semana. Y así hay muchas regulaciones que protegen a los niños del trabajo infantil. Respecto de cómo se afrontan las distintas situaciones vinculadas a la prevención de estos incidentes y lesiones en niños, existen varios casos de articulaciones público-privadas, principalmente desarrollados por organismos del gobierno que se suman a organizaciones de productores y a la parte privada, es decir, a las empresas del sector agropecuario, en las cuales construyen centros de cuidados infantiles en los distintos lugares del país. Estos centros de cuidados infantiles están direccionados principalmente a los hijos de trabajadores rurales, es decir, aquellos, por ejemplo, que trabajan en la época de cosecha de determinado tipo de fruto, como puede ser la frutilla o el arándano, y que no tienen dónde dejar a sus hijos mientras realizan las tareas rurales. De esta manera, las empresas se aseguran que estos niños no terminen en el lugar de trabajo de sus padres. Y esto a la vez genera en distintos lugares, en distintas provincias, un lugar seguro para disminuir y prevenir estos incidentes en niños en el medio rural. Como no existe tampoco un programa a nivel nacional vinculado a lo que tenga que ver con el cuidado de los niños rurales, este vacío, esta falta de acciones vinculadas a la prevención y al cuidado de los niños en la agricultura, ha sido cubierto por un gran labor realizado por las mujeres rurales y las mujeres cooperativistas de cooperativas agrícola-ganaderas de nuestro país. Como sabemos, la mujer se encarga del cuidado de la salud y seguridad de todos en el campo, y los niños no son la excepción. Entonces, de esta manera, estos grupos de mujeres rurales, de mujeres cooperativistas, organizan muy, muy, muy frecuentemente actividades de capacitación y entrenamiento cada vez que pueden para no solo los niños, sino también para los padres. Y de esta manera se logra llenar ese vacío que existe en nuestro país de falta de actividades de prevención y capacitación en salud y seguridad agropecuaria. Muchas gracias.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thank you very much for listening. So, as you will have noticed, I'm Richard Franklin. I'm from Australia in North Queensland, which is very much on the eastern seaboard up towards the top part of Australia in the tropics. We've got in Australia about 26.4 million people, and we're reasonably low density. The bulk of our density is down the east coast, particularly in our city areas and mainly our capital cities rather than the rural population. The rest of the rural population, which is 13% of the Australian population, which has been decreasing over the last few years, is really spread out across the rest of Australia, except for those small, as I said, metropolitan areas. Currently, we produce about $60 billion worth of agricultural produce in Australia, and the aim is to try and produce about $100 billion worth in the next 10 years, to be aiming in 2030 to be doing that on an annual basis. We've got a number of challenges when you start to look at agriculture in Australia. You can see, sorry, just go back to the previous slide. You can see that the kind of the big ones that we've got are cereal grains and beef cattle, and then we've got a lot of other agricultural produce that we produce in Australia. It's a highly productive sort of country, but a lot of large agricultural activities, particularly the cereal grains and beef cattle. We've got some challenges around the workforce at the moment, and I raise that because we're bringing in a number of Pacific Islanders and those from Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea into Australia to work. What that's doing is changing some of the workplace health and safety challenges, particularly those that are bringing family members as well onto farms, and the challenges that we see sort of around that. If we go to the next slide and start to talk about workplace health and safety, we have for children over the sort of decade, we had about 222 deaths, which is about 10 a year that we can see kind of occurring, and about 500 hospitalised. A lot of these are mainly, as Barb was talking about earlier on, due to high energy interactions, machinery and vehicles in particular, particularly tractors and quad bikes. And unfortunately, we had a 16-year-old die in a quad bike related incident 2 days ago down in Tasmania while I was preparing this talk. We see similar sorts of things with the non-fatal, but we don't see so many horse-related deaths. We see a lot around quad bikes and to a lesser extent motorcycles with kids, but horses and other animals are more likely to cause non-fatal sort of injuries and incidents as we go through. We also see a lot of fall-related issues, and drowning is a significant issue, as most properties have what we would call a dam or a pond in the US that holds water most of the time. And I say that because we're just going into a drought at the moment. So during drought, the dams will empty out, creating a slightly different hazard with lots of mud and challenges around that as well. But predominantly, these are areas that when kids get in, you can't see to the bottom of them. They're very brown in colour, and they're used by stock, so they're very hard to restrict access to those areas. If we go on to the next slide, which really talks about some of the things that we're doing, I've kind of put these into three main groupings. We're doing a lot of work around schools and education. We've got resources for the curriculum that links in with what the children are learning around, their physical education activities, their health and society activities, their agricultural activities. And we have a number of interactive resources that are being developed to try and what's called gamify. It's kind of the safety area and get them excited about it. We also do a whole range of other training where safety is embedded in the training of children learning agriculture. And so that means that when they come along, they will be taught things around the very low level issues, obviously around personal protective equipment, through to thinking about policies and procedures that are on farms, including ensuring that they're appropriately inducted when they come onto a farm. We have a whole range of programs, but I would say that they're somewhat ad hoc. While they have been running for a long period of time, they have moments of large amounts of excitement when there's a little bit of money, either from government or from a sponsor on the table. And then they kind of sit in the background just sitting there, not doing a lot. So Safe Play Areas has been a major program across Australia, trying to make sure that kids have an area to play in and can't get out. We have a program called Keep Watch on the Farms, which is very much around water safety and ensuring the kids don't end up in rivers, creeks and dams. We do have a number of community service announcements, often put on free of charge by the rural television stations. That's changing, unfortunately, with the changing media landscape in Australia. We're seeing less diversity in media, lots more of it being centralised into metropolitan areas, which means it's much harder to get some of these community service announcements into rural areas. It also, I think, as Barb mentioned before, means that there are different attitudes that are coming through when some of these incidents are being reported on in the media. Similar to the US, you're unlikely to be prosecuted if your child dies on farms, but we are seeing greater attention by the regulatory authorities around child injuries and deaths on farms. So it is probably only a matter of time before farming families start to feel the weight of legislation. We're also developing a whole lot of online resources. This includes checklists, apps, websites to try and help people do things. We've got a whole program around farm rules. And you can see here, this is my 3 boys a couple of years ago at their grandfather's farm. And here we're talking about making sure that the tractor is locked. You can see one of my twins there trying to climb into the tractor. You give them 2 minutes, they're up in there playing around, and also making sure that keys and the starters of machinery are stored elsewhere rather than within the machines to prevent children getting access to them. This also goes to things like silos, and unfortunately, a few weeks ago, we had a 12-year-old child die in a silo. There's a mobile silo that they were feeding out of on the farm. So again, trying to get rules in place that means that children aren't on pieces of machinery is really important. The other big thing that we have done is not so much in the primary prevention space, but more in the tertiary prevention space around emergency services, is do a numbering system across Australia for all farms. This numbering system allows emergency services to know exactly where the entrance to the farm is, as we were having a number of problems with emergency services not knowing where to go, particularly as they started to centralise those services. And the last thing that we've been doing is looking at the legislation and making sure that is in place around farms to keep kids safe, and that includes the workplace health and safety legislation, as well as rules around child labour and where children can work or not work. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'll be speaking about Burkina Faso. I hope my internet connection will hold. If not, I'll switch off the video if it deteriorates. So Burkina Faso is currently about 18.7 million according to the World Bank data, but we had a more recent national population census, which estimates the population at over 20 million, about 20.5 million. So as Florence has highlighted before, we have the highest population density among the countries that we are presenting on today. And we also have, if we go to the agricultural side, we have the highest share of agriculture, fishing, and forestry in GDP, which is above 20%. And when you look at the GDP per capita, we are on the lower side because it's very low. I was looking at the numbers presented by Marcos for Argentina. We had about the same percent of population under the national poverty line. I think his was about 39%. We are at 41%, but the GDP, the gap in the GDP of the two countries was really striking to me. Low-income country, but we have a very young population and a lot of challenges to be able to provide education services for all these youth. I think more than 60% of the population in the country is under the age of 20. So this is it's a lot, and also that means you need to provide a lot of services in terms of health and education. But for now, we are doing well in primary education, which is close to universal provision, but we had a setback with it. Ongoing security situation, which has deteriorated over the years. A lot of schools have closed, so I'm sure the numbers have gone down from 5 years ago or so. But at secondary level, it's quite low. Only 14% of people age 25 and over have completed secondary education. Regarding the agricultural sector, women have a very important place in the sector, with 76% of women working in the sector. The same thing for men, they are almost up to par with men, 71%. So a large part of the population, active population, is working in the ag sector. And the major agricultural commodities are sorghum, millet, corn for the food crops, and also rice, to a lesser extent. But sorghum and millet are really the ones that are dominating in terms of share of cereal produced. And the main cash crop is cotton. And regarding the children, we have about 41.1% of children between the ages of 5 and 17 that are estimated to be active, economically active, working as apprentice, in all the sectors, not just in agriculture, but also in all the sectors. We have a number of over 50% of children, working somehow, whether it's in the ag sector or in any other sector. And so children have a very big place in as farm hands and, helping parents around the farms. But with the security situation ongoing, there's a lot of people who have been displaced, because we have about 20 million now, with 10%, over 2 million people that have been displaced from where they used to live. That means that numbers have probably changed in terms of capacity to work in the same sectors as where the home areas, where they used to live. So the security situation has changed many things. Regarding what is going on in terms of injuries and fatalities, it's very difficult to find data. What we're able to find is information about people who have died by ingesting food, from farms that have used pesticides, and they died from pesticide poisoning. About 18 people in an area died, and among them, I think there was at least 5 children and 13 people from the same family. So which means that pesticide use is not really controlled, although we have laws in place, but the laws are not being enforced. And with the current really difficult security situation, it's more difficult for the authorities to control what is being brought into the country, because, with the terror groups, controlling part of the country in some areas, it's difficult to know what is coming in and what is not coming into the country. So that also probably had an impact, but we don't have the information yet. And other than that, it's just anecdotal evidence that you get from the newspapers and things like that, but we don't have a means of compiling all this information. And also, but we just hear that, maybe a child fell from a tree trying to collect some non-timber forest products, got injured, but sometimes you can't know the extent of the injury, because they don't really go to, they probably go to the, the local person, who is doing traditional medicine and get something from there, or they don't really go to hospitals, or they don't have the means to do so. They try to just, get some, medical care, but from, the local traditional medicine people. So it's difficult to get numbers about the injuries and fatalities, other than, the numbers that have been put out about pesticide poisoning. That in 2019, the 18 people that died was in 2019, but in 2016, it was estimated that, countrywide, I think they had a survey about that showed that more than 300 people had some type of poisoning from using from pesticides use. In 3 regions, 341 people were estimated to have suffered from, pesticide related illness. So that's also quite a big issue. And the major causes of incidents, no other than fatalities, is usually having contact with animal and plants, bites, poisoning, infection, parasites, allergy, intoxication, from what medical personnel will tell you, but we don't have anything compiled to say how many people have had such incidents. And yes, I already talked about the exposure to chemical, which is really one of the major problems, maybe because it's the one that also gets more talked about in the local media, in the press. So next slide, please. So in terms of the measures that have been that have been put in place either by the government or by other entities to try and reduce farm injuries in children. First of all, in terms of public policies, because the numbers that we have now, are really old. We only had a survey about child labor in 2006. In 2019, a new strategy was put in place and data collection started in 2022 last year. So we don't have the data yet about child labor, a countrywide survey to try and estimate what's the prevalence of child labor and be able to use that to inform the policy and and the strategy that has been that is currently in place. The strategy is called National Strategy to Combat the Worst Form of Child Labor, which runs from 2019 to 2023. Should be ending this year, but I think they'll probably review it and try and design one for the coming years, because like I said, we have a very big issue at hand. Is security first. So everything that was being done got delayed because of trying to put more resources into solving the security situation first. Other than that, some public policies that help support family, with children. It's a nationwide policy of free healthcare for children under 5 and pregnant women. So it's not just for people that work in farms, but since it's a nationwide policy, people who are working in farms are also, beneficiaries of this program. There are also national laws trying to put in place to specifically protect children. For example, the country has ratified Convention number 184 of the UN on Health and Safety in Agriculture in 2009. So it's not just about children, but it's everyone again. But since it's a convention about everyone in agriculture, children are also will benefit from it. We also have other, specific laws in the country on child labor and on apprenticeship contract, because a lot of children are working, like the data has shown on the first slide. A lot of people take children to do apprenticeship in, either in farms or in mechanic shops and things like that. So we try to put laws in place and to protect those children. And we also have a permanent secretary of the National Plan of Action for Children, who has been put in place, but hasn't been working well because they don't have enough of the funding that they need to be able to, conduct the activities, because most of the resources right now is really towards bringing security back in the country. Other initiatives, apart from what the state has been doing, include, civil society and other development partners who are trying to put in place some surveillance body called Comité Villageois de Surveillance in French, which means village surveillance committee to try and do raise awareness about dangers and injuries that can befall on people, and especially children working in the agricultural sector. Pesticide, including the pesticide exposure to pesticide and other chemicals and other injuries that one can sustain working in agriculture. Another initiative from the World Bank and also from an NGO called Solidar Suisse is to provide some healthcare support for women working in the agricultural sector. So we call them creche mobiles, which are, mobile, daycares that follows women where they work. Sometimes they have a cooperative, doing some agricultural production in a specific area. One or two or three women would be, paid or, given in-kind compensation to watch the children, while the others are working, in the ag production. So that helps women, do a better job at, producing the crops and all that, and also have, peace of mind about how, children not running around and, getting injured around the areas where they work. So these are some of the things that are being done. And again, most of these things that the state has been doing, and also some of the NGOs, it's quite more difficult now to do them everywhere where they used to work because of the security situation. Some areas are difficult to get to, and until the security situation is solved, it's going to be difficult to get, the adequate information about what is being done and what has been achieved. So I think I'll stop here and hand over to Sweden. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to be involved here as well from Sweden. And it has been a pleasure working with this production of this important book project. Sweden, yes, it's in the northern parts of Europe. Population nowadays, it's more than 10 million, and we have quite a large proportion nowadays of people coming from other countries, refugees and others, putting a lot of strain on a lot of stuff. But there are not so much involved in agriculture, even if they're coming from other countries as when they come to live here. But we have quite a high proportion of migrant workers during the seasons for harvesting seasons and things like that. We are not very much density of people. They are in the northern parts, they're quite a low frequency of people living around. There are a lot of nature and harsh environments, but there is a lot of forests and mining productions and mining and things like that. But then there have major cities in the east, west, and the very south. And I'm myself at the university campus in the very south of Sweden, close to Denmark and Copenhagen. And we have the agricultural sector is quite small. I would say when it comes to economical part, the forestry is much more important than what the forestry products. But still, there is quite a number of people working in agriculture, and it's active agriculture all through the whole country, from the very south to the very north. We even have quite a good agriculture production above the Arctic Circle, because there is a 24-hour daylight in the summertime, so you can grow quite interesting products up there, and we have dairy production and everything as well there. So and our major agriculture products are dairy production, pigs and chicken, and different type of crops like cereals, but also potatoes and other stuff. We can take another one. Well, it's a country with we have not so many when it used to be. It's quite a lot of farms have been gone, and they are nowadays joined together to be increased to be larger farms. But still, they're very much dominated by family-operated farms. And also in the old days, there used to be a lot of people on even also the small farms, but now it's only the big farms that have a lot of employees. And as I said, maybe when it's harvesting seasons, you might have more workers there, like seasonal workers, but many farms are still small and in the situation where one parent is often having another daytime work and go away from the farm, and then you have the problem how to take care of the kids. And if you're living close to village or a town or something, you can have access to daycare, preschools, which are very good and you have entitled to. But if you have that kind of problems that is far away and it's not practical, they can stay home with the other parent. Then that person has to have the challenge of taking care of the children at the same time as doing the chores. That can be quite tricky sometimes, especially if they are small. But sometimes they even bring their kids into the tractors, but they think about it, so they have often they install child seats in the tractors and have them sitting there with safety belts in a quite a good way. That's how Swedish farmers do sometimes, even it's not to recommend. We don't have any official statistics when it comes to child injuries on farms. But of course, if there is a serious one or a fatal one, it will be in the media. And often it's, and when we have these kind of incidents, it's often related to farm tractors and other big machines. And use of ATVs, quad bikes. It's often kids do when they're quite young. They use ATVs and quad bikes, quite popular in rural areas. And especially the girls growing up on farms, they often have horses, or they also work and take care of other large animals or help out on the farm. And talking about fatalities, we've had lately fatalities with small children being run over by a tractor that running out, and the parents didn't know where the kid was, and it was run over by a tractor. So that is, if you lose the control and big machines, that could be tricky. And we also had last week a fatal incident with a teenager with horses. So that sometimes we have them. So about 1 or 2 fatal accidents with injury with the children we have every year. And we have been looking at the attitudes to risks and injury, and we can see that many of the farm parents, they seem to be very aware of risks and what to do to protect them, but when it's stressful situations, when it comes to seasons like harvesting and in the springtime, maybe they make mistakes and they lose the control over their kids. Sometimes they can not have the same access to control as they have in other parts of the year. And sometimes they let the kids also do stuff that's not according to the Swedish legislation. Can I have the next one? And in Sweden, we have always been a country with a lot of things important for children. So we have all kinds of international agreements that we accept the rights of children and things like that. That's very important. And we have an ombudsman for children since many years, which looks after the interest and protects the interests of children's rights in the society in all different ways. And since 1979, it's illegal. You're not allowed to hit your child. Even if you're very upset of your kids, you will never allow to hit them. In the old days, it was allowed even both in home and in the school. If I understand right, it was the first country in the world to put a ban on that. We have a long tradition of protecting children in traffic and developing different type of solutions such as the rear-facing car seat that was done here. And we also have very good preschool care system for the children when parents are working and open year-round. And if you are not living too far away from them, they're very good and they are you have to pay in relation to your income and how much that you are using the preschool. So that's a good system and very popular also about farm parents if it's and the children if it's not too far away. And we have seen also that we don't have any actual real programs when it comes to directly on farm prevention when it comes to children and their health and safety. We don't have any programs directly for them, but we have a different type of major programs for health and safety in agriculture. We always include aspects of how to make it safe on a farm for children. So there will be a new program starting in 2024, which also will include the health and safety of children. And we also recently made major studies on rural crime and effects of animal rights activism and so on. And we saw that and got a lot of reports on that. The children on farms, they are really feeling really bad about these kind of incidents with animal rights activism. But it's also a problem nowadays when it comes to schools and things like that. Farm children being bullied about their parents sending saying that the parents are killers or murderers, sending their animals to the butcher, to the slaughterhouses and things like that. So that's my final message. I think it's important that we should also include the mental health and well-being when it comes to these aspects of how children are being worried about the problems that the parents have with running their farms. And if the parents have mental issues, we should also not forget about the welfare of the children when it comes to those aspects. Thank you.
Well, hello again, and I want to thank Peter for that presentation and just let you know that I've been doing this kind of work for more than 30 years. And in the early years, I always went to Sweden and talked to Peter and his colleagues about everything that you seem to be doing right in your country. And we tried to model some of our ideas in the United States after the experiences that you've had in Sweden, because I think you were really a leader in protecting children in agriculture. So from there, I'll just tell you a bit about the United States. We're different than some of the other countries in that we have 320 million people. Population density is, a little bit heavier than Sweden, but most of that, again, is in certain parts of the country. And our gross domestic product per capita is 56,000, so higher than the other countries you heard from. But we also have a fair amount of poverty in our country, and the majority of people over age 25 have received a secondary education. And then just looking at farms in particular, we have over 2 million farms, and that number has been pretty much steady. 2 million farms with almost 1 million children who live and work on farms. And of those, about half of them participate in the work on their family farms. And like you heard in Sweden, many of the small family farms have merged to be multiple families and larger farms. And we've kind of lost sort of the mid-sized farms. So there's many more very large and now a growing number of very small, unique farms that have just a small kind of niche product. So we also have about 265,000 youth who are hired to work on farms. And one of the areas that's becoming of a greater concern now is sort of the farm production, or right next to the farm where they might be handling, the poultry production or the killing and of certain animals. And then wherever the product is being processed, they're starting to pull the young people in to work in those areas, mostly because of a labor shortage. So we have a lot of farms, a lot of people, but just a small proportion of women and men of the country actually participate in agriculture. And as you can imagine, it's a large country with a lot of different climates, a lot of different commodities. So many different types of products are produced. A large proportion are consumed and used in our country, but many of the products are also exported as well. And more recently, just, a lot of issues having to do with climate change, flooding, drought, and wildfires is a big issue now that is changing the kind of exposure that people have when they're working in agriculture. So big picture, lots of complications. And so that kind of falls in line with what kind of injuries we have, and then what are the approaches, because they're very, very different. So in the US, we did up until 2016, for about a 14-year period, we had very good national statistics collected by the government and reported every 2 to 3 years. And what we learned from that was, first of all, the big surprise was the great proportion of children who were injured or killed were not working. Then from that, what we saw was sort of an overall decline, except for the older kids, the 16 and older, who were actually more actively engaged in work. So in general, we think that the numbers are going down. And the causes of serious injuries are, as you've heard before, the motorized vehicles, tractors, ATVs, and large animals. And next slide. When we talk about the children who die on farms, the graph here actually shows hired youth age 15 to 17, and the green bar shows agriculture, and this goes from 2008 to 2016. And you can see that if you're a teenager working in agriculture, you're up to 8 times more likely to die at work than all other industries combined. So it's not a lot of kids, but the proportion who are seriously injured or killed is much higher in agriculture than others. And we talk about 105 deaths a year on farms of children under 18 years of age. Of the work-related deaths, agriculture is the most deadly. And we mentioned the same types of things, operating vehicles, tractors, and young people could be operating them. They could be sitting on them. They could just be nearby and be run over by them. And then other just contact with machinery and large animals. If you're not working, and children as bystanders, the ages where it's most likely to happen is 2 to 6 years old. You know, they're just old enough to walk and just old enough to kind of ramble around by themselves, and just at the point where the parents think they can take an eye off of them for a little while and they'll be okay. But what we know is that almost all children of that age who are injured or killed, the parents thought they were supervising. They thought somebody was supervising. But, you know, little kids, they go fast and they can hide, and you don't see them right away. So this notion, like, just supervise, it's incorrect. We have to get rid of that notion that supervision will protect children. And of these little kids, we talk again about tractor runovers and then drowning in ponds and pits and different kinds of water reserves and large animal contacts. So that's pretty much the picture which you heard definitely from Sweden and Australia, very much of the same picture. And the next slide. So what are we doing in the US to reduce these injuries? We've been fortunate, and that since 1996, we've really had sort of some plans, national level plans. So the first one was in 1996, which established what federal agency should be responsible and how they should use their funds. And that was, you know, the start of collecting data. And then that national plan, which our center helped coordinate, was updated in 2006, again in 2012. And we're currently working on updating it with a planned release for early 2025. And that plan actually includes, you know, public policy, what kind of research do we need, what kind of data do we need, what types of interventions, what kind of like public programs and general awareness is recommended. We've also had the federal funding from our National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which goes to our center in Marshfield to sort of like coordinate what's going on in the government, with what are the many different private programs going on, and federal funding from the Department of Agriculture for education and outreach in a clearinghouse. And then we have these partnerships and communication via the Child Egg Safety Network, which is free online, and you can just join in and get periodic updates, and people kind of talk to each other and help each other out with programs. And then there's multiple safety resources for public use. Many of them are posted on the website based out of our center called Cultivate Safety. And that's the thing, there's just so many resources. If it's tractors or milking cows or working in a grain bin or hand harvesting fruits and vegetables, there's many different resources that people can use and translate into different languages. So no shortage of those, but as was mentioned before, I think by Peter, there's sometimes attitudes and practices that people just either don't want to know, don't want to spend time with a safety training. But for the most part, at least in the US, parents do know what's safe, and they do know what's not safe. We mentioned about policy and regulations. In the US, we have child labor and agriculture laws, which allow children in agriculture to work more hours at a younger age than compared to all other types of work. And we also have this listing of hazardous occupation orders, which forbids certain tasks such as pesticide handling. But again, they can start at a younger age. And all of these laws are outdated, and attempts to try to update them have met great resistance, mostly from the big farm organizations. And in the US, the farm organizations are famous for, they don't want any rules, they don't want anyone telling them what to do. So what are the gaps? We still have a lot of gaps that we're trying to address. A big one is childcare. We talked about getting young children off of the farm is a very protective strategy, but not always practical, not always possible. And there's very little government support to pay for childcare, whether it's the city or farm. And then limited enforcement of laws and hesitancy to hold adults accountable for unsafe conditions. So it's sort of a free range of what people can do on a small family farm in terms of what they allow their kids to do, and with minimal oversight from anyone. So that's sort of the story that I have to tell. Big country, lots of different things going on. We try really hard to coordinate amongst each other. And if anyone is looking for an idea for a program, there's others who are very interested in helping. And I think we really have come a long way in raising awareness about what this situation is, and come a long way in really making it less acceptable to have kids be in unsafe situations. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Barb, and thank you so much to Marcos, Richard, Eugenie, Peter, for all this time. So we have, what I'm going to do now is we run a bit over time based on the original plan on the presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question to all the panelists. But what Marion is doing in the chat box is she's also asking all of you who are here today what you would prefer to do next with the remainder of the time. Either more time for questions with the panelists, or do we jump into small group discussions for all of you to interact with one another? So again, Marion is putting the question in the chat box. Do folks want to have more time with the panel for me to ask questions, you to ask your questions, or do you want to go into those small group discussions? But for now, I have lots of questions for the panelists, but one thing that was really clear across all the presentations, except for maybe the US, is the lack of data on the situations around children ag health and safety. But based on the data that we have, we know that children are exposed at higher rates of injuries and fatalities. And so my question for you panelists is, what do you think the lack of data is doing in terms of awareness about the challenges that children face in agriculture, as well as what kind of implications does that lack of data has to address the challenges faced by children?
Bueno, si puedo empezar a responder esa pregunta, lo fundamental es entender que ante la falta de estadísticas es muy poco lo que se puede hacer, es decir, no saber claramente qué es lo que está ocurriendo implica que sea muy difícil que podamos empezar a invertir recursos bien direccionados y de manera eficiente para solucionar los problemas que existen. Así que especialmente en Argentina estamos necesitando urgentemente el desarrollo de un centro de investigación sobre todo lo que tiene que ver salud y seguridad agropecuaria, que incluye como un pilar, un tema fundamental, el tema de los niños.
Thank you, Marcos. Richard, I see you've unmuted.
I have, Florence, and I think this is one of the big questions when we deal with safety across the board, is the lack of data. There's two aspects that we're talking about. One is actually understanding exposure, and exposure is really challenging to understand, particularly with children. And we heard some examples throughout the talks of, trying to understand what children are actually doing on farms and where they are going. Some work that we did a number of years ago found that children had a range of about 4 or 5 kilometers. So I think what's that about 3 miles that they would range on a property. So that's a large area that children can move around. The other part is then knowing what they're getting into, what they're being injured by. Now we have better information about that, and we know that often high energy and high risk situations is where children are dying from. What we don't know is how many of those that children are actually exposed to. Is it the first time that they go into a silo that they end up dying? Is it 1 in 10 times? We don't really know what the appropriate risk is, which goes to what Carlos was saying about designing appropriate programs and really trying to educate people about how risky some of these things are for children, because they're designed for adults. And we often forget that as children grow and want to participate, that they're actually living in an adult world where they are smaller, not as strong, and often don't have the same cognition. So it's a really complex area, and it's an interesting area to do research in, but it's also an area where I think we can do lots of things now. Restricting access is really effective. If you can keep kids out of areas, that means that they don't get in trouble in the first place. Barb's comment about supervision is correct. We only understand a little bit about supervision, and the word supervision is used so widely to talk about a whole range of different situations. So when you start to talk to parents, they go, "Oh, I'm supervising," even though they're sitting on the porch and the kid's out playing somewhere, and that's not really what we're talking about around supervision. And I think appropriate skill development, which Barb might like to talk a little bit more about, but there's been some really nice work out of the US thinking about age-appropriate tasks. And because kids do want to get involved and parents do want to give their children this experience. And so we've got to recognize this challenge from a safety perspective about how do we bring children into the workplace and keep them safe.
Thank you, Richard. I was going to say, panelists Peter, Marion, Marcos, and Eugenie, you're free to, turn on your camera if you can, if your internet allows. But Peter, I see you've had your hand up for this question.
Yeah, okay. In the best of worlds, we would like to have good statistics, but I mean, in Sweden, and even the farmers, they don't have any incentives to report injuries because we have a free healthcare. So if you go to a hospital and you're being fixed and then you go home again and nobody asked you what was the situation and what kind of occupation do you have or anything. So I think if we don't have any kind of incentives why you should report an injury, in the health system or for in relation to your occupation or anywhere. It's very tough to have it. But when we see when there is a serious injury with or fatality with children, it's often very well covered in media. Like we had an overturning with a mower. A 12-year-old kid, he helped the neighbor, and that was not really allowed according to the legislation. That was very much into the media. So I think when it happens, it is serious things like in Sweden, it will be good covered. But of course, we should have good statistics. That would be the best situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you're talking about the power of the media, and I do know that in the US there has been some key media stories around injuries of children and around farm workers that have led to important changes. Before I ask the next question, Barb and Eugenie, anything you'd like to add around lack of awareness on the safety of children and what that means in terms of doing something about it?
Just a quick word on it. I think Peter and all the others that spoken before him, already said most of the things, but I want to emphasize the having evidence to show people. I believe that if we had more media coverage on the not just the fatalities but even the incidents, and it could be at least if the media is documenting with the age of technology, people are more aware of things because they have these WhatsApp groups and things like that. That will get it will help raise awareness, I believe, faster than maybe the government trying to compile the data and then do a report and show it. Nobody will read it. At least in Burkina, I know no one will read that. But if it's the media covering it, if it has videos about it, or even radio talk shows or things on TV about it, people will get more information about it. Exposure is it's an issue. You shouldn't play with pesticides, because what happens is people really don't know. They use the container that the pesticides had and put water in it, and sometimes children will drink from it. That's how some kids died, and they don't know that you shouldn't do that. So it's we really need the media to step in, together with the government to try and raise awareness. Would be a way of trying to solve the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
And Florence, I'll just chime in and add on to this whole media discussion, because what we have found is that it is the stories that get the family to sit down around the table and talk about, well, that happened there. Could it happen here? And what could we do about it? And I think any of us can be contacting the media and encouraging them to tell the story and add into that story, how can this have been prevented, without making the family feel guilty. But the more coverage we have of these, the more family conversations there are, and the more likely they are to say, we at our home farm level could do something so it doesn't happen to us.
Thank you, Barb. So another thing that I heard across almost all of the presentations, I think, is the tension between there are laws in the books to protect the children, or there are laws in the book to provide more resources to families, but those in reality, they might not happen the way they are in the books. I'd like to hear examples from your countries, if you have them, of times when that tension was resolved, or when policymakers and decision makers were called out for doing something about the situation. Or I guess I was trying to put a positive spin on things and be constructive, but if you have examples of when that did not work and what you learned from it, that's also a way to think about it.
I'm glad you added when it didn't work, because I think that's much easier to tell that story. But I'll wait and let somebody else talk about that.
And one thing I want to say quickly is there are some questions that are coming in the chat box that are directed to some of our panelists specifically. So there's one for Peter, there's one for Eugenie. So for Peter, Eugenie, if you want to respond to those questions in the chat box, you're welcome to. Yeah, let's hear about examples from your country around the tension between what's on the books and what's happening.
Bueno, respecto de lo que tiene que ver con las leyes en nuestro país, las leyes son bastante claras respecto de cosas puntuales que indican la prohibición de que todos los menores de 16 años hagan trabajos rurales, que incluso se especifica que sean agentes causales de daño en el desarrollo psicofísico de los niños o adolescentes en este caso, o que interfiera en su escolaridad. Es decir, todas aquellas tareas agrícolas que se lleven adelante por estos chicos están prohibidas. Eso es muy claro, pero ¿qué pasa? La realidad también es imposible que en cada lugar de nuestro país se pueda eso llegar a fiscalizar y a tener presente. Igualmente, hay un gran compromiso tanto del sector privado, y esto hay que recalcarlo de lo que pasa acá en Argentina, hay un gran compromiso del sector privado agropecuario, así como de los sindicatos y de todas las instituciones vinculadas al cuidado de lo que tiene que ver con el trabajo infantil, que están muy comprometidas con evitar que haya niños trabajando en el campo, tanto del sector privado como del sector público, y eso es algo muy, muy positivo que vemos en nuestro sector agropecuario. Si bien hay situaciones y casos, como en todos lados, que nunca dejan de existir lamentablemente, sí vemos que hay un gran compromiso por evitar este tipo de situaciones y se cuida mucho que esto no suceda, como dije, tanto del sector privado como del sector público.
I have an example from a World Bank project that was implemented in Burkina Faso a few years ago. It was a project that was trying to support income-generating activities, more specifically for women, but they hired both men and women, but try to, encourage women to work in, cleaning up, areas of a city. If it's in rural areas, it will involve, repaving, dirt roads that were damaged during the rainy season by bringing dirt and, and things to try and repave the road just to make it usable. And in that program, when they select you, well, whether you're a man or woman, you're supposed to just come and work. You're not supposed to bring your child. And most of the women who were selected had young children, 5, 6, children who are not of school age, between 0 and 5 or 6. And they were trying to hide, because it was an international project, they probably know that you shouldn't bring your child to work, but they were trying to hide the fact that they had children. But they didn't know when the project supervisors would come and and see if everything is working according to the rules that they signed on. And one of the World Bank team came and was coming to supervise the project and visit and see how things are going. And so some women who had young children on their backs trying to pound on on dirt on the roads, paving some potholes on the road, and others, trying to clean dirt in the, around the city, having children on their backs. And, they're really shocked because of it was hot, it's under the sun, and also there's dust and everything. And other kids were running around, not far from the road. Like they said, well, what should we do? We can't really kick them out because we're trying to do this to help them, They will only be in the program for 6 months, trying to save money and use it to develop another income generating activity. So that's why they decided to do those mobile creche, so mobile daycare support, to help somebody, you know, watch the kids while the women are working. So they paid for it. They trained the people who were supposed to take care of the kids, and they would give food to the kids and, you know, games for them to do under a shaded tree or a shaded you know, structure that is, you know, that is easy to move, because those people don't work on the same things every day around the city. They do public, you know, labor intensive works around the city to clean up things and, you know, repave roads and things like that. So that was something that was done by the World Bank, trying to, you know, solve this kind of issue where, you know that you shouldn't do something, but you know, it turns out to be a positive thing for those women and also for the children that got the daycare support. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenie. And thank you so much for bringing the childcare piece, which I think is another similarities across different countries. Here in the US, childcare can be expensive and hard to get. When we've done a study, over 75% of farm parents said that childcare was just too expensive, not available, and so forth. And so the idea that even if we make a recommendation, which has been talked about, it might not be possible for folks to implement. Any other thoughts on that question around the tension between, you know, the rules or policies and how people can implement? And I also want to point to the questions that have been paused, that have been asked in the chat box. And I'm going to, I don't know if all of you on the panel can see the chat box. I'm going to read them and then you can respond as you wish, as we have about 5 minutes left together. Maida, hello Maida from Slovenia. Maida asked, what are the obstacles to not collecting statistics on accidents involving children on farms? And then there was another one for Mohamed that I know some folks have been responding to in the chat box, but Mohamed asked, what about specific training systems, curricula for children involved in agricultural work? Do they exist? Do all children have a chance to attend such trainings?
Florence, I can address the first one about the obstacle to collecting data. In the US, it's money. And that just came down to that we had a system and it became too expensive because the number of farms was changing, the number of kids exposed to injuries was changing. So you needed to collect a lot more data to get better estimates or legitimate estimates. So it was just a matter of money. And on top of that, the option of who really wants to give you that information. Like Peter mentioned, if you don't have to report it, you don't want to, and it's just one extra step. And again, the independence of the farming community is such that many times they don't want people to know what's happening to their kids on their farm. So those are the obstacles we face.
Just in response to that, Barb, it's quite interesting here in Australia. The corporate ag sector is actually probably one of the better sectors in making sure that children are protected on farms, mainly because the workplace health and safety laws are pretty tough on the corporate producers. And it's the smaller family farms, but also some of those lifestyle farms where people are seeking to get away from city areas and think farming's idyllic and a great lifestyle, that then let their children roam across other properties. So we see a slightly different activity going on, and it's more the family or smaller size farms that we see some of the problems occurring in.
Peter, Eugenie, Marcos? Any answers to this question? And then
Sí.
at that point,
en nuestro país tenemos la experiencia de lo que es la recolección de datos de envenenamientos por agroquímicos, y que es una situación de denuncia obligatoria. Es decir, cuando una persona llega a un servicio de salud, el sistema de salud debe recolectar la información respecto de ese caso y enviarla para ser registrada en una base de datos, y de esa manera podemos saber, por ejemplo, si el envenenamiento, cómo ocurrió. No solamente hablamos de productos fitosanitarios, productos químicos que se usan en el campo para las plagas, sino también para aquellas plagas que se usan en el hogar, tomisanitarios los llamamos nosotros. Entonces, de esa manera tenemos un registro todos los años de los casos que ocurren por envenenamientos por plaguicidas. Respecto de lo que son los accidentes rurales en niños específicamente, los incidentes, podemos tener presente que estas situaciones, al ser atendidas en el sistema de salud, tanto privado como público, se podría generar el mismo sistema de denuncia obligatoria, es decir, los profesionales de la salud que atienden el caso pueden, luego de registrar ese incidente, transmitirlo a la base de datos y de esa manera podríamos saber qué está ocurriendo. Algo parecido también ocurre con los incidentes viales, así que yo creo que en nuestro país sería una posibilidad de concretar y llevar adelante este sistema de recopilación de casos de incidentes y lesiones en el campo de los niños. Y la otra pregunta que han hecho respecto de cómo es la cuestión educacional, respecto de la prevención de incidentes rurales, y nosotros vemos que en las escuelas, tanto rurales como urbanas, no solamente en el nivel inicial, en el nivel primario, sino también en las escuelas agrotécnicas o nivel secundario que le llamamos nosotros, e incluso, y más grave aún, a niveles universitarios, niveles superiores, ya sea en las facultades de agronomía, de veterinaria o de medicina, el tema de la prevención de incidentes rurales y mucho menos en niños es un tema que no existe. Nuestros docentes de los niveles iniciales no conocen las formas o no tienen información ni capacitación de cómo transmitir medidas de prevención y enseñar tanto a los niños como a sus familiares acerca de cómo cuidarse en el campo.
Thanks, Marcos. All right, so I want to thank all of our panelists today for sharing about your countries, the situation, sharing your expertise. And, you know, personally, I've learned a lot from all of you. So thank you again for taking the time, even though for some of you it was also at very inconvenient times. And I'm looking at you, Richard. It's probably around midnight or 1 now. So what we're going to do now is a wrap up from Marion, who is going to wrap up the webinar and talk about upcoming opportunities as well with IAWA. Thank you so much again for coming.
Thanks, Florence. Just to check with Isabel and Natalie. Sorry, yes, we're just concluding at this stage, so sorry about that. So yes, thank you to everyone for, I think we had a really rich and informative webinar with speakers from across the globe. And it's just to summarize, I suppose, firstly, we had Barbara Lee, who outlines the importance of the topic. And I suppose some take-home messages that I took from Barb's presentation was around the importance of the language replacement of the word accident with injury. And we really need to encourage, I suppose, the media and our governments to take this on board and encourage the change. Also, that it's a highly complex area with multiple factors such as age, development, working, not working in the industry, the environmental conditions, cultural and social conditions, meaning that there's not a one simple fix in order to protect children. And I suppose we've heard about some of the preventative, protective strategies that could be used. So next then we had some really interesting perspectives from the 5 different countries, from Richard from Australia, Marcos from Argentina, Eugenie from Burkina Faso, Peter from Sweden, and Barb again from the United States, giving an overview of their challenges and current actions and perspectives in terms of protecting children, which were really good, and I think highlighted that despite differences between countries, there is an awful lot of similarities in terms of the challenges, such as many countries lack of data, lack of government support or law enforcement, and again, a wide range of risks, and a lack of childcare and economic stability in some countries. Again, the speakers highlighted, I suppose, the measures that could be taken place. So that would be the programs, education, the legislation in some countries, and I suppose through the discussion and also through those presentations, what was highlighted to me was the importance of future work in this area to gather, I suppose, essential statistics, yearly statistics, to focus on education and training, focus on policy reform and enforcement and government support, and the support of getting the media involved in discussions on this topic. So I suppose despite the importance of this subject, it was not well addressed by the last activities of the IAWA, and I suppose its importance was highlighted by the special issue. And we've seen that involvements might vary from stakeholder to stakeholder and between countries, but it's pertinent that we think about the future of workers towards achieving decent work. So youth is not just about setting up young people in farming, but it's also about safeguarding the youngest and most vulnerable people in our societies. That is our children, some of whom will go on to be the next generation of farmers or wage earners. And to paraphrase a quote from Richard Franklin from his paper in the special issue, that growing up on farms provides many life experiences that other children do not get to experience. And often these activities and experiences are encouraged by parents. However, there's a need to ensure that they occur safely and parents understand what they need to do to ensure the safety of children. And I suppose it's all our responsibility, whether we have children or not, to safeguard those most vulnerable within our societies. So before I wrap up and thank the presenters, I'd like to just highlight some future IAWA activities, which are likely to include a webinar in 2024 on work in Africa, and also a potential symposium in 2025 in Switzerland. And just to refer to the IAWA website and to sign up for the newsletter to keep informed of the activities of the association. Finally, this webinar would not be possible without the input of our 5 speakers, and on behalf of IAWA and the webinar organising committee, I'd like to extend my thanks to each and every one of you who have presented today and also who put in the work in terms of preparing the slides beforehand. And as well as the presenters, I would also like to extend my thanks to those of you who have participated within our discussions and who interacted by writing questions in the chat box, which added to the richness and informity of the questions and discussion. So thank you for your participation and interaction. And I'd also like to just thank the organising committee for putting this webinar together. There's a lot of work went behind the scenes to get it up and running smoothly. So hopefully each and every single one of you here today will use this opportunity to connect and network with others working in the area with the similar goal of, I suppose, safeguarding our most vulnerable people in society, our children. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you again.